welcome back to another episode of Vancouver Real, and welcome to the first day of the rest of your life. My name is Andy Zaremba, and I'm flying solo today behind the helm because my brother is up to here in babies at home, so he couldn't make it with us today, but that's all right. We have a very special episode lined up for you, and it is the first one of our Tedx Stanley Park series, where we've been given the privilege by our good friend Roger Killen he's the producer of Tedx Stanley Park, to interview all of the Tedx Stanley Park speakers this year. And this is the first one. So from now until Tedx Stanley Park, which is March, what's the date of the event again?
It's March 3rd, actually.
March 3rd. So basically we have all Tedx Stanley Park speakers coming at you, minus one or two that we have scheduled on the show. So you have a lot to look forward to there. And as usual, we are recording out of 70 West Cordova Street here in Gastown, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And we're actually out of our business called Float House. And if you haven't heard of Float House, go to www.floathouse.ca and you can learn all about flotation therapy and all the benefits that it has for people. One of the things I personally find it really beneficial for is staying on top of my stress. And, being a business owner, being a parent myself, running a podcast, pretty much always on the go with different community events and things like that. And I think it's really important just to stay on top of your stress levels, because it is something that can compound. And we know that's stress, if it's continuous, it becomes chronic, that can definitely have detrimental effects on your health. It's going to compromise your immune system, which can cause a whole host of problems. And personally, I find that if I get in there, for myself, I get in there sort of once a week to go and float, it definitely down-regulates all of your stress responses. It decreases your stress hormones and helps your body function more optimally. So if you'd like to give that a shot, you can use the promo code VancouverReal. That will get you a 20% discount on a single float. And of course, if you are attending Tedx Stanley Park this year, you'll be receiving one complimentary float with the purchase of your ticket. So we will be seeing all the TEDx attendees here. Also, as usual, I'd like to give a shout out to the Vancouver Real community. It's a members group page that we have going. You can look it up on Facebook, Vancouver Real community page. And every month we host different events, and they're all for free. Different workshops. We do movement workshops. We've done search engine optimization workshops. We've done nutrition workshops. We've done movement. So we do a whole host of different things that are generally fall in the same scope of interest that we cover here at Vancouver Real. And if you'd like to get involved and stay linked into what's happening in that community, just join up with the Vancouver Real community Facebook page. And lastly, I'd like to give a shout out to Mindful Mass. And Mindful Mass is the meditation group that we started. And what we basically do is once a quarter or so, we go to a public space in and around Vancouver, and we have giant mass meditations. And currently right now, we are running a 30-day meditation challenge. So if you have been interested in developing a meditation practice, but maybe haven't been that regular with it and needed support to really get it going, this is a good opportunity, because we've opened up the group page as sort of a forum so people can post and share about their experiences and also receive support if they need that. And the page there is called the Mindful Mass Vancouver Meditation Mob. So if you look for that page on Facebook, you'll definitely find it. And you should definitely come out to one of the Vancouver Real meetups or the meditations and get involved with the community. So today, I again mentioned I'm very privileged to be doing the first of the Tedx Stanley Park interviews. And I'm very honored to be interviewing Mohammed Alsaleh. Did I say that correctly?
Mohammed Alsaleh.
Alsaleh.
Thank you.
Awesome. And Mohammed has a very amazing story, which he is going to be sharing on the big stage of Tedx Stanley Park. And well, first of all, welcome to Vancouver Real.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Mohammed, for people who have been following, the refugee crisis in Syria and that situation, I think this is going to be a very informative podcast for them, because you've been dealing with this experience firsthand. And this is going to be a big part of the talk that you're giving at Tedx Stanley Park. So why don't we start off by you giving us an overview of what you're going to be covering in your talk, and then we'll go into maybe why you've chosen this topic.
Sure. So I am going to speak about the global refugee crisis. I chose this topic because of my first-hand experience of being a Syrian refugee myself. I'm very privileged actually to have this opportunity to represent the voice of refugees. The global number of refugees today is a record number, an unprecedented 65 million refugees. That is, and this is a number that is increasing by 30,000 a day. My talk is all about managing the crisis. By starting to recognize that we do have a crisis, and what we need to do right now is try to prevent it from becoming a catastrophe. I argue that in today's world, you're either a refugee or somebody that has to deal with the refugee crisis. And if this crisis doesn't get the attention it needs, we are looking at a catastrophe that will change the face of the earth. And I chose Tedx Stanley Park stage to share my ideas because it's the biggest TEDx event in Vancouver, and one of the biggest events in the world that invites close to 3,000 people. And my personal experience have actually taught me that us as individuals, we are so powerful, and change starts from the individual. And inspiring people to take brave action is the theme of TEDx Stanley Park, and that's where I come from.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. And it's been a huge topic in the media for the past few years now, really. And it's definitely been gaining steam. And maybe you had mentioned that it could be a potential catastrophe. Now, we already know that it is a huge crisis. But if it's not dealt with properly, what do you think are some of the potential outcomes of this?
Well, the number of refugees today is larger than the numbers of refugees during the Second World War, but nobody is treating this crisis on a war footing. And the numbers that I am talking about, and the numbers that I am finding throughout my research preparing for this talk, are shocking. What I really or one of the things that people doesn't really pay attention to is this assumption that refugees are some other people that are far away from us, and if it doesn't really affect me, I don't really care.
Kind of like the out of sight, out of mind idea.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And but in the same time, if we go back to the definition of a refugee, if you open any dictionary, the definition is a refugee is somebody who has been forced to leave their home because of war, persecution, or natural disaster. And throughout the year, last year, we've been seeing more and more natural disasters that is displacing people. And in my opinion, this is the one of the underestimated factors that is contributing to the crisis. Who thought, somebody who lives in Miami, Florida, would they ever think that they would become refugees? They just did. Because of the two hurricanes that happened in just now. Here at home, the wildfires in BC have displaced thousands of people. And the list just keeps on growing. Now, having in mind the traditional ways of becoming refugees, these numbers are really increasing rapidly, and you can say they are multiplying in a really exponential rate. And in fact, the Environmental Justice Foundation predicts that in the next 30 years, global warming alone will force up to 150 million people to go to other countries. So the question here is, where are these people going to go? And where are we going to go? The refugee crisis is no longer a single country issue or an isolated case. It's coming to our doorstep. And it's our responsibility to recognize that, embrace it, and deal with it, avoiding the catastrophe.
So I guess the catastrophe would come in the form of the mass migration that would have to happen because people being displaced, obviously, right? What are some of the, let's say, living in Vancouver, and there is this mass displacement of people that happens, if it's, from the current situation in Syria, or if it's from a natural disaster or whatever. What are some of the impacts that you can see at a local level that could affect people's lives, like firsthand? Because you said, like, if it's not really in people's view, a lot of times it's easy to forget about or ignore. But, eventually it's going to be at our doorstep. So how can that affect us at a more local level?
For sure. We started seeing more and more impacts of the global refugee crisis here in Canada and especially here in Vancouver. It's been highlighted on the news how thousands of people were crossing the border between the US and Canada seeking refuge. Add to that the fact that this outpouring influx of refugees that is coming to Canada can is
happening, is migrating.
It's happening in an increasing rate. So far, we are doing very good in terms of containing it, and I don't think it's going to have catastrophic effects here. However, I think what can be done right now is trying to look at the refugee influx as a solution rather than a problem. Whereas we have a lot of jobs that people here don't really want, and in the other hand, refugees are so motivated to start a new life and would do anything to achieve that. So I think we can use the refugee crisis, then we can use or we can try to embrace the fact that we have a crisis and try to come out with solutions out of it.
Absolutely. To the best of my knowledge, there's going to be a labor crisis in BC and I think across Canada as well, and it's going to get worse in like the 2020s. And that could be a potential solution. I heard a stat somewhere that new immigrants, or maybe it was the children of new immigrants, one or the other, but they're actually more likely to be successful than native-born people because of like their drive and their work ethic that they have. Because, like you mentioned, when they first come here, they're so motivated and they're so thankful and grateful for that opportunity. So I do think that there could be an opportunity there because, let's be honest too, there's a lot of jobs in Canada that a lot of Canadian-born people don't necessarily want. However, if they're like somebody starting a new life in a new country, I'm sure they'd be more than happy and grateful to take those jobs. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and that's one of the ways where we can actually look at the refugee crisis as a solution to fill some gaps rather than a problem.
Yeah.
In fact, research shows that after a certain number of years, I can't really quite recall the number of years, but after a certain number of years, refugees would have the same employment or unemployment rate compared to fellow Canadians. Yeah. And and then there is another mark where they contribute. They have contributed in taxes what they have already received from Canada.
So they've already paid for themselves, basically.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and and that's one of the things that we can come out when we embrace the refugee crisis is actually looking at it as a down payment on a future investment.
Sure.
Canada has a really a really great tradition of welcoming refugees, and we are seeing more and more people that came here. If it was people who came in the 70s from Vietnam or the 80s with the Ismailis, they have given back to society in spades. Absolutely. And they are really shining examples in society. And we, recently arrived refugees, really look up to these examples, and that makes me personally feel so inspired and know that I can give back to this beautiful country that once extended a helping hand to me and welcomed me here, and actually be one of these people that have given back and have embraced the fact that we have such a wonderful model of looking at each other as people and providing people with a new opportunity when they need to.
Absolutely. My fiance's parents are Vietnamese, and they were actually displaced from the Vietnam War.
Oh,
and they
wow.
made their ways here, and they actually ended up in Red Deer, Alberta. That's where they ended up. And, I've heard a lot of stories about their struggles over the years. And, of course, immigrating to a new country is going to be full of struggles. But, they did improve their situation. They came to a country that built a life for themselves. Now their children have better opportunities. And that's really, like you said, Canada has a rich history of supporting that. So I think it's an amazing thing. And, of course, that was due to, the war in Vietnam back then. But I'd like to backtrack a little bit and go into the current conflict in Syria. And, it kind of goes on and off in the mainstream media. Like, it gets coverage sometimes and then it doesn't. And I don't know if people have a good history of, how it ended up in the situation that it's in. I was wondering if you could share your perspective on how things have gone that way.
Absolutely, and thank you for this question. It's really important to talk about the root causes of the issue. And I think it's worth mentioning that before the Syrian conflict, the global number of refugees was at about 50 million people. And now it's 65 million. So these 15 million additional refugees are actually the people who were just recently displaced by the ongoing war in Syria that started in the year 2011. If I try to explain to you what's happening on the ground right now, I don't think this podcast will be enough to cover it. But if we backtrack to talk about what happened in Syria in 2011 and how did we get here, I think I can do the job.
Excellent.
So what happened in Syria? Before 2011, we had a really normal life where I personally, I was a university student. I was studying at the Faculty of Medicine, and my dream was to become an oncologist, and I really wanted to fight and cure this disease. I lost my favorite cousin to cancer, and that's how I had the dream. But life had other plans for me and for my fellow Syrians. In the year 2011, the war broke out. And the way it happened is, the traditional dictatorship story where dictators play the dirty game of giving their people security in exchange of freedom. So as long as they are the one supreme leader, people are safe and can have a normal life. But once you start demanding your freedom back from the government, they open the hell gates on you and they declare war on you. At least that's what happened in Syria.
So basically the dictatorship was put in place sort of at the trust of the people, in the name of safety, is what you're saying.
Not even in the name of people, because the rulership was hijacked by the coup of 1970. But going back to my original point, In 2011, the Syrian people was inspired by the Arab Spring. Now, the Arab Spring started in Tunisia, and then a domino effect took place. So the Egyptians were inspired by the Tunisians, and so on. In Syria, we were inspired by this freedom movement in the region, and we really wanted to have that. We wanted to have justice and freedom and normal lives that people like you in the West would take for granted. Elections and freedom of speech and having the ability to record a podcast freely without being policed for it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely appreciate that.
Well, I hope RCMP or CSIS are not harassing you or policing you.
Not anytime soon, hopefully. Yeah.
Well, good thing you're not
yet.
in Syria.
Yeah, definitely.
But if you want to do this in Syria, you need to get 3 or 4 security permits to be able to do this. And that was our reality. Even though you have some certain freedoms or, happy life, or maybe the freedom to have satellite channels, that was like the maximum level of freedom that you can have in Syria, but nothing beyond that.
Right, so you couldn't broadcast your opinions or anything like that?
No. You don't even have an opinion. Let me put it that way.
Right, or the government said you didn't have an opinion.
Yes, because the government will make the policy, will make all the decisions. It's actually, a lot of people get shocked when they hear that it's written in the Syrian constitution that only one party can lead the country. It's written as a law.
Wow.
That's how the dictatorship and the ruling party have designed the dictatorship in Syria. So when we, inspired by the Arab Spring and started asking for our rights, we were faced by violence. And I can still remember that moment when the freedom rallies started emerging all across the country. You know what happened? What was the response from the government? They sent the army to the streets. They started shooting at people right away. And that's how the spark of violence started in Syria. Now, the way or why do we have this complex situation on the ground? Basically because the international community didn't really respond to what's happening in Syria, and the actions were just developing, and a snowball of violence was growing and growing. Whereas you have a brutal government shooting at people. People are getting so desperate, so they start defending themselves. The peaceful uprising became militarized, and I think that was the turning point. That's when it got out of hand, and that's when it became a proxy war, where the government has its Russian and Iranian allies. The people of Syria had the support of the West and the Gulf countries in the region, and it shifted to a proxy war where each player have an outsider backing them, and therefore following their agenda. Because if you don't have your we have a very famous Arabic saying: if you don't have your food, you don't have your decision. If you don't own your food, you don't own your decision. And that's basically how the Syrian situation was hijacked by all the stakeholders, and it got so complicated. The other turning point would be when ISIS appeared on the picture, and that was in the year 2013, and also in that year, the government used chemical weapons. So these two factors, in my opinion, the rise of ISIS, the use of chemical weapons against civilians, were the two events that changed the face of Syria, and were, to me, that's when I knew that the Syria I know will never be back. And actually, that led to my escape of the country, among other reasons that I can tell you later as well.
Right. I don't understand. So when ISIS came on the scene, all of a sudden, were there who is ISIS fighting for or are they fighting for themselves, basically?
ISIS is a really independent militia that have their own ideology and their own agendas that they want to implement. One of the unluckiest thing about Syria is its location, being neighbors with Iraq. Now, Iraq has been destroyed by war since 2003, and there is a lot of unrest, and there is a lot of terrorist activities in that country post the US invasion and the fall of Saddam Hussein and all of these events. So when the Syrian uprising became militarized, that have created a space for outside militias to come and be active. And because we're neighbors with Iraq, ISIS simply crossed the borders, and back then they were called Islamic State of Iraq, ISI.
Yeah.
When they crossed to Syria, they became ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria,
Yes.
ISIS.
Yes.
And their agenda is they shared it with the public. They want to establish their own medieval state that is anti-civilization and anti everything new. They want to go back to in history to a time where swords were used and modern laws and life didn't really exist. One of the messages or lessons that I think the Syrian exodus and the fact that Syria has actually lost half of its pre-war population, one of the messages or lessons to be learned from that is when those I'm trying to look for a word to describe them, but
take your time. Yep.
Maybe when those scums came to our country claiming that they are establishing an Islamic state, a state for the Muslims, well, guess what? Muslims are running away from you, and that's a message that we send to the people. They are claiming to give us a state. We don't want it. We want civilization. We want to be aligned with modern life and with the West and with the free world. And that's why you've seen after 2013 and the events that happened after ISIS's intervention, people started fleeing in crazy numbers. And back then in 2015, actually, that's the peak of the refugee crisis. A flow of 5,000 people a day were crossing the Mediterranean, fleeing the conflict to Europe, and that says something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a terrible situation. And from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, the reason that there hasn't been as much intervention is because of the backings. People are afraid that if one side goes in and attacks or helps one side too much, that it could escalate the entire situation. Is that part of the problem?
That's exactly the problem right now. But if we back up and just analyze what happened, the lack of intervention was actually the main problem. Namely, what happened in 2013 when the Assad government, the dictatorship, used chemical weapons against civilians. President Obama at the time said that this is a red line, unacceptable, America is going to do something. Now what happened is Russia intervened and they made a deal where Assad hands his chemical arsenal to the US and the US will forget about it. So what does that say to me as what?
It's fine.
So what does that say to me and to the Syrian people? That simply says that Assad was told by the international community that it's okay to kill people with conventional weapons. Kill them softly. Don't use weapons of mass destruction, but we don't have a problem with what you do otherwise. And that's why I feel betrayed and I feel really disappointed in the global view on the Syrian crisis and on other crises. And that's actually one of my motivations to be part of Tedx Stanley Park and actually try to inspire brave action and try to change the world.
Okay, so It's, and like you said before too, it's an extremely complicated situation, right? It's very complicated. However, if someone is living in Canada, because that's where most of our listeners are from anyways, and they're hearing this message and they're hearing what you have to say about this, what can somebody do if they do want to take action and become part of the solution?
I really think that it starts with you as a person and how you think, how you perceive things, and how do you respond to them. I really like that famous saying that says, think globally and act locally. And that's what we need to do. We need to be informed about what's happening in the world and start by ourselves, by sometimes by embracing certain things or recognizing that they exist and try to implement them in our day-to-day life. As I shared with you earlier, one of the biggest reasons for displacement, and actually 1/3 of the existing 65 million refugees have been displaced by climate-related events.
Right. Yeah.
So being mindful of that, recognize that climate change is a fact. It's not fake news. It's something that is displacing millions of people. By embracing that, by implementing this knowledge in your day-to-day life, when you reduce and reuse and recycle, you're actually preventing the refugee crisis from becoming a catastrophe. Small things can make a huge difference.
Excellent. So be mindful of their day-to-day activities. What can say a nation do, like Canada, to help prepare for the influx of refugees that might be coming?
Canada is a global leader when it comes to refugee resettlement, especially after the decline of refugee resettlement numbers by the United States. One of the things that the Canadian government was trying to do on a global scale is actually exporting our private sponsorship of refugees model.
To different, like European countries.
Different countries.
Sure.
Here in Canada, we are the only country in the world that actually offers the opportunity for private citizens to contribute into the efforts of resettling refugees, whether if it was to fully sponsor them or partner with the government, where the government can pay for the half of the sponsorship and private citizens will do the other half. And one of the awesome things that is happening on a global scale is actually trying to introduce this system to other countries. And if you read about the program, the private sponsorship program, it's highlighted that one of the benefits is actually providing additionality, because the government and other governments in the world do resettle a certain number of refugees. But here in Canada, we invite additional number of refugees because of the interest that comes from the public. So it's provide additionality, and it helps people that wouldn't have the opportunity otherwise. And also one of the things that Canada is actually changing on a global scale is actually shifting the view or actually showing the other half of the picture. Whereas, refugees are often viewed as poor, unemployed, dark-skinned people from the third world, and they are victimized all the time. Whereas here in Canada, we see many examples of refugees that have came here and have actually started a new life, and they are actually active members of our society. Here in Vancouver, we have plenty of examples, and Canadian news actually highlights a lot of success stories. And these Canadian stories is actually the truth. Most of the time, the title refugee kind of covers the identity of refugees. So the title will make you forget that refugees are actually doctors and teachers and farmers and people that had lives and they have actually built a life there and had a family and kids, but they lost it. That's how they became a refugee. So if you want to help them get back on their feet. And that's what we do in Canada. And by continuing to do what we are already doing, I think we're doing a great thing. And Canada is definitely the global leader for refugee resettlement.
That's amazing. And just before we wrap up a little bit here, obviously I could tell you're very motivated to get this message out to people. But what motivates you personally? Like what drives you so much to be so active and be pushing this message so hard?
Oh, Andy. Well, I'm gonna share with you one story from Syria. It's the story of how I survived death. Because of the fact that I was also inspired by the Arab Spring and I was active in the freedom movement, I had to face arrest and detention and torture by the Syrian government. I might not look that old, I'm only 28, but in this short lifetime, I have been arrested 3 times. I have been interrogated in 7 different detention centers, and in fact, I consider myself lucky to be alive and able to share this information with you. And it's actually a promise I made to myself in prison. I promised myself that if I ever survive this, first, I will go as far as I can from there, and secondly, I will be the voice of those people who died there. And I'm trying my best to do that. I'm trying my best to raise awareness about the Syrian conflict, refugees, even homelessness, marginalized communities. I think when we have an ability to be active and contribute to the society, we should be the voice of those who don't have it. So I'm very active here in town in many capacities. My main focus of refugees, because I'm a refugee myself, and I have a lot to share with that. But I also volunteer with other groups, and I try to help other folks who need help as well.
That's amazing. It's very powerful and inspiring. And, I hope that because of the platforms that, we're providing here and the different Tedx organizations, which ones did you speak at before?
Well, I have actually spoken at Tedx East Van that happened in September 2016. And my talk was actually focused on my experience of surviving torture and how I was able to do that. The only thing that kept me going and keeping me going is hope, and always having hope and never letting go. Because the fact that you're alive means that you are a survivor. You're not dead yet. You can do stuff.
So you mean hope that you're gonna get through the ordeal, hope that you're gonna continue to live afterwards. Is that what you're saying? Exactly.
And that's the essence of the spirit of the Syrian people. The war started in 2011, so we are coming to the 7th anniversary soon, and still our people are still so determined, resilient, love life, and really fighting to not let go. Many people ask me why the Syrian refugee crisis peaked in 2015 and continued after. Why didn't it happen before? And the answer is what I just said, having hope that they can return to their home. The Syrian people stayed in refugee camps in countries neighboring Syria from 2011 until 2015. They only started crossing the Mediterranean and seeking refuge in the West after ISIS, after the chemical attack, after we all knew that the Syria that we know will never be back.
Yep. Are there any other messages that you want to get out today? Anything else that you need to say?
Well, I need to say thank you. I need to say thank you to Canada, to Canadians, to you, to everybody who have, to everybody who shares the Canadian values of welcoming others, believing in others, and looking at others as human people, as human beings, as normal people. That sentiment have saved my life. That sentiment is actually saving lives every day. Canada welcomes 300,000 immigrants every year, 40,000 of which are refugees. So we're good at both helping ourselves and helping others. And thank you, Canada, for that. And thank you, Andy, for having me here today.
Well, thank you for being so brave and sharing your story with us.
Thank you so much.
If anybody wants to get a hold of you or connect with you somehow, how can they reach out to you?
Sure. You can look me up on social media. I am on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. It's Mohammed Alsaleh, Mohammed. Alsaleh is Alsaleh. Or you can email me. And I didn't use my first and last name in my email, so I don't have to spell it all the time.
Yeah.
So my email is goforwest@gmail.com. So go, GOFORWEST @gmail.com.
And of course, if they want to see you in person, they can come out to Tedx Stanley Park and listen to your talk. So lots of ways to get connected. And thank you very much for being a voice, and your passion and inspiration for what you're doing is amazing. It's an amazing story. It's very powerful. And I hope that this podcast and also Tedx Stanley Park gives you the platform that you need to spread your message. And of course, for the listeners out there, if you felt that this was a message worth sharing, feel free to share it on your channels. Share Mohammed's message, because I think it's one that's a really important one.
And do connect. I'd love to connect with you and share ideas, and together we can really change the world. It's a lovely spot that you've got here. I have to say, I really enjoyed being here, Andy. Thank you.
Well, welcome. Well, thank you for coming on, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. And of course, if you like what you heard today, give us a rating and review on iTunes, YouTube, or Stitcher. And if you'd like to give flotation therapy a try, you can use the promo code VancouverReal. That will get you a 20% discount on a single float. And I think we can pretty much wrap it up. So we'll be releasing this episode in about a week's time. So until next time, to whatever is. Thank you.